The Great Flood was real, and we are still here. So now, just for a while, let's gently turn the camera around. Not on comets or mammoths or drowned coastlines, but on you and on the strange, fragile civilization you're falling asleep inside tonight. Because if there's one question that keeps echoing after everything we've just walked through, it's this. If the slate were wiped again, what would be left of us? Imagine it's far in the future. Not 10 years, not 100, but 10,000. The numbers blur out a little at that scale, like light seen through rain. Maybe there's been another great reset. Maybe not. Maybe the climate changed slowly. Maybe something fell from the sky again, the way something did at the start of the Younger Dryas. We don't know, but picture someone standing where you live now, on ground that may or may not be land anymore. The buildings you know are long gone. Steel is rusted. Glass is shattered. Concrete has slumped back toward dust. The plastic is still there, broken and sun-bleached, but no one remembers what a shopping bag was. They scrape at a slope with a stick or a trowel or some tool we haven't thought of yet, and they hit a layer that feels wrong. Above it, normal soil, roots, burrows, the quiet work of time. Below it, older sediments, river sand, ancient clay. But in this thin band between, they find something else. Bits of metal turned to fragile flakes. Tiny glass beads that were once screens. Particles of pure, unnatural carbon from a time when people burned buried sunlight on an industrial scale. A faint spike of radioisotopes, leftover fingerprints from nuclear tests we conducted in what we call the 20th century. A layer of microplastics so pervasive that even after erosion and flood and drift, they still cling to the sediment like confetti from a party that never really ended. To them, this band in Earth is what the Younger Dryas black mat is to us at places like Murray Springs or Abu Huraira. A weird, thin message from a very specific moment. A line that says, clearly and quietly, something different happened here. We already know, in plain science, that future geologists will be able to spot our time from rocks alone. We've changed the chemistry of the atmosphere, the distribution of sediments, the composition of reefs and soils. We've scattered aluminum, concrete, alloys, plastics into places they never existed before. If you drill down through the layers of what we're leaving, you hit the Anthropocene like a bell. But imagine you don't have words like Anthropocene. Imagine you're that far future person, or the descendant of a survivor of some future shock, standing at a cut in the earth the way we stand at Younger Dryas sites, wondering about the line in front of you. What story would you tell? You might imagine a race of gods, beings who could turn night into day with their cities, who trapped lightning in wires and pulled ancient fire out of the ground. You might picture them covering the planet in roads and towers, and then somehow losing all of it. You might see them vanishing overnight in some terrible judgment, or more likely, you might imagine a long, messy, uneven decline, centuries of faltering, waves of collapse, a slow unraveling instead of one clean cut. We don't know which, if any, of those futures is coming. We are not prophets. We only know that the rock remembers what we do, whether we mean it to or not. Think about how unfairly we judge the past. We look at Clovis Point, a fluted spearhead, and see simple stone tool, even though it took brilliant engineering, generations of trial and error, and an entire cultural system built around hunting giants to create it. We look at megalithic walls in Peru or Lebanon and say, primitive, even as modern engineers quietly admit that replicating those fits with our machines would be expensive and difficult. Now imagine some far future person picking up one of our objects, the thing you might have in your pocket right now, a phone with no towers, a circuit board with no power grid, a plastic bottle with a language no one speaks. Would they think we were unimaginably advanced or weirdly wasteful? Or would the meanings we attach to these objects be completely gone, the way the original meanings of Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe or the spirals at Newgrange are gone for us? You hold your life inside glowing rectangles. They might see only a shiny rock that doesn't do anything. Here's a quieter question. If the material things fade, as they always do, what about the stories? The people who survived the last great flood? Whatever exactly happened at the end of the Younger Dryas didn't leave behind hard drives, servers, or cloud backups. They left genetics, land use patterns, carved stone, and most importantly, tales. Oral histories carried in song, ritual, bedtime whispers for thousands of years. That's the part that's hardest for us to imagine, because we outsource our memory to machines now. Your photos, your messages, your documents float in data centers you will never see. Your daily life is archived more thoroughly than any pharaohs, any kings. And yet, in some ways, you remember less. If all the screens went dark tomorrow, if the networks went quiet, how much of your world could you carry just in your mind and your voice? Could you recite the story of your grandparents, of your town, of your people, your science, your sky? The survivors of the last great flood had no choice. Memory or oblivion. Tell the children, or let the whole thing vanish. That's why, when they built Göbekli Tepe or Stonehenge or Nabta Playa, they didn't carve shopping lists. They carved what mattered. They encoded the story of the sky and the turning of a year, the coming of the flood and the return of the sun. So here's a gentle, maybe slightly unsettling thought to drift on. If you had to choose just one story from our time to send 12,000 years into the future, one message to survive fire, ice, and rising seas, what would it be? Would it be a scientific paper explaining orbital mechanics, the physics of impacts, so that future people could spot and divert the kind of object that may have triggered the younger Dryas? Would it be a simple manual on how to make clean water, grow food, avoid disease, in case the reset is so deep that basic survival knowledge is lost? Would it be a list of mistakes not to repeat? Burning fossil fuels, building at sea level, stockpiling weapons that can end everything in an afternoon? Or would it be something strange and more human? A story about who we were, about kindness, cruelty, art, grief, joy, a myth that carries not facts but values? We don't know which kind of message is most important. The people of Göbekli Tepe seem to have tried to do both at once, to blend sky data with symbolism, fact with meaning, observation with ritual. Maybe that's what all good stories are, including the ones you're listening to tonight. Half history, half spell. 1 foot in data, 1 foot in dream. We can say with some confidence that if another great flood comes, it will leave its own signature in coral and ice and sediment. We can model how many meters the sea might rise for a given amount of warming. We can track how many asteroids we've found, and how many are still invisible in the glare of the sun. Those are the things we know. The maybe lies in what kind of story our descendants will tell about us when they stand at our boundary layer. Will we be the careless giants who had everything and squandered it, the way we sometimes imagine those Atlanteans of legend? Or will we be the people who finally listened, who took the old warning seriously, who looked up at the sky, down at the rising water, and chose differently? No one can answer that tonight, but you're allowed, here in the quiet dark, to imagine the gentler version. Imagine that centuries from now, under a calmer sky, someone kneels at the edge of a cut in the earth, tracing the strange line that marks our time. They know about us from their own records, their own myths, their own stones. Maybe they don't curse us. Maybe they thank us. Because instead of being just another civilization buried under its own flood, we became the first one that learned to see the wave coming and chose to soften it. That's not guaranteed. It's just a possibility. A maybe, but so is your existence. So is every successful step we've ever taken out of the shadow of an ice sheet, away from a drowned coast, toward a warmer fire. You are, in a very real sense, a long and probable chain of maybes that didn't fail. And as you drift toward sleep, you can let that thought sit with you like a quiet stone. We come from survivors. We live in a pause between storms. We remember a great flood, even when we pretend we don't. And somewhere, deep in the bones of the world, the rock is already writing our chapter, grain by grain. Grain by grain, the rock is already writing our chapter. But unlike the people who lived through the last great flood, we have something they didn't. We can watch the writing happen in real time. We can see, at least a little, what marks we're leaving behind. And we can choose, if we want to write some of it on purpose. Let that rest in your mind for a moment. Ancient people placed their memories in stone because it was the most durable thing they knew. A carved pillar, a carefully arranged circle of rocks, a mound aligned with sunrise on the shortest day of the year. For them, those were permanent. For us, they look delicate, eroded, breakable. We build with glass and steel and concrete. and assume that mean forever. But to the planet, to deep time, they're only slightly more elaborate sandcastles. So what happens when a civilization starts to realize that it's temporary, and at the same time powerful enough to plan for its own disappearance? We've begun to dabble in something no previous culture we know of has attempted at the scale. Deliberate long-term messages. You can almost think of them as our modern Göbekli Teeps. Right now, there are spacecraft slipping out of the solar system with our fingerprints on them. Tiny metal emissaries carrying sounds and images, simple diagrams of where we live, etched into plates and discs. A kind of cosmic time capsule thrown into the dark. We've sent radio pulses into space that encode numbers and shapes, hoping that someone, someday, might understand what we mean by hello, deep under Arctic rock. We've tucked away seeds from crops all over the world, a backup garden in case something goes wrong up here on the surface. There are projects quietly working to etch entire libraries of text and images onto materials that might last millions of years. Quartz, sapphire, even tiny metal foils that could survive fire, flood, rust, and time better than paper or plastic ever could. Some people are even talking about storing knowledge off-world, on the moon, on Mars, in orbiting vaults that would outlive any earthquake or rising sea down here below. These are not myths. They're real efforts, fragmented and experimental, but driven by the same instinct that led people 11,600 years ago to haul stones up a hill in Turkey. The words are different. The tools are different. The impulse is the same. Do not forget. Tell the future we were here. Tell them what hurt us. Tell them what helped. But here's the strange twist. We're the first global civilization that can deliberately plan messages for thousands, even tens of thousands of years. And at the same time, we're also the first that can see the larger pattern we're embedded in, the cycles of climate and rock in orbit that make some catastrophes more than random bad luck. Because Earth doesn't sit quietly in space. It moves through a crowded neighborhood. Every year, our planet plows through streams of dust and debris left behind by comets that pass long before anyone was watching. Most of that debris is harmless, grain-sized particles that burn up as gentle shooting stars on summer nights. You've seen them, lying on your back in a dark field or on a rooftop, watching thin streaks of light scratch briefly across the sky. The Perseids in August, the Leonids in November, the Geminids in December. We treat them as romantic or as wishes, tiny fireworks that seem to mean nothing more than look up. But astronomers will tell you some of those meteor showers are just a faint edge of something bigger. There's one in particular that makes some researchers uneasy, the Taurid Stream. It's a broad river of debris spread along part of Earth's orbit, probably the leftovers of a very large comet that fragmented over tens of thousands of years. Most of the time, the bits we hit are small, dust, pebbles, little rocks. But there are hints, orbital clues, and scattered observations that larger chunks may be lurking in that stream. Not dinosaur killers, but big enough to ruin a region, a country, maybe a hemisphere, if we met one at the wrong time, in the wrong place. Some scientists have cautiously suggested that the event at the start of the Younger Dryas might be connected to the same debris family. That 12,900 years ago, we plowed through a denser, nastier section of that stream and paid the price. That's a maybe, not a certainty. Others disagree. They point to other explanations for the black mats, for the extinctions, for the spikes and the ice cores. We don't have the smoking gun, the neat, circular crater that says, right here, this rock did it. What we have is a pattern that feels suggestive, a dangerous river of rubble crossed by a planet that doesn't know how to duck. And if that's even possibly true, then the people who built sky-watching monuments after the last flood started to look less like mystics and more like realists. Imagine being the great-grandchild of someone who saw fire fall. You don't know what a comet is. You don't have orbital mechanics. You don't have telescopes. All you know is that once the sky went wrong. The patterns you could rely on, sun rising here, setting there, stars hanging politely in their constellations, were interrupted by something terrible. Maybe your elders told you. It came from that part of the sky and pointed to a cluster of stars, a section of the horizon. Maybe they said, when the stars look like this, when the sun is here and the moon is there, be careful. You can't write that in a textbook. You can't send an alert to a phone. What you can do is turn the landscape into a memory. So you plant stones along a line. You carve certain animals in a particular order. You mark the rising of a bright star with a corridor of light that pierces a tomb once a year. You train people, generation after generation, to come to that place on that day and pay attention to the sky. They might forget why. Eventually, they might start to say, we do this because the gods demand it, or because it's good luck for the harvest. But the behavior survives long after the original reasoning dissolves. That's what we see when we look at these ancient sites now. Behaviors that outlive their explanations. And it's hard not to wonder what behaviors of ours might drift forward in the same way. Picture a far future, not shattered by catastrophe, but gently changed by time. Maybe satellites have fallen. Servers have long since corroded. Radio has been replaced by something else entirely. But every year, in some city built on the bones of your city, people still gather at the shore on a particular day to watch the sun rise over a certain angle of water. They might not remember that this ritual began as a climate march, or a remembrance of flood, or a festival held when sea walls were finished. They might not know that the date was once tied to a report, a treaty, a warning. They only know that on this day, we go to the edge of the water and look east together. From the outside, from the perspective of geological time, our monuments and their monuments blend into the same pattern. Animals and spirals, crosses and circles, crowds walking toward the light. From the inside, for you right now, it feels much more tangled. You have news feeds instead of oral epics. You have climate graphs instead of pollen cores. You have hazard maps and evacuation routes instead of whole mythologies woven around a single hilltop or stone. But underneath all of that, the deeper question hasn't changed. How does a species that lives day to day remember something that happens once in 10,000 years? The people of the younger Dryas answer with stories and stones. We're answering with data, with rockets, with seed vaults, with little metal messengers drifting between the stars. And with something else too, with you, lying there in the dark, letting this story sink into the softer layers beneath your everyday thoughts. You are, in your own quiet way, part of the memory system. Every time you hear a flood myth and think history, not just fable, you reinforce a tiny path in your brain, a neural groove our ancestors began carving when they watched the first waters rise. Every time you look up at a meteor shower and feel a flicker of awe tinged with caution, a sense that the sky is beautiful but also capable of sudden cruelty, you're resonating with people who saw that beauty turn lethal. Every time you read about rising seas, shrinking ice, or near-Earth objects in the news, and you feel both fear and responsibility, you're standing at the crossroads of ancient trauma and modern ability. You can't stop the planet from circling the sun. You can't erase the debris streams we pass through, or halt the slow dance of ice ages in and out. But you can remember. You can care. You can be one of the minds that keeps the warning alive, and maybe, just maybe, helps us act on it. The last great flood nearly erased us, and yet, somehow, the memory of it survived long enough to reach your ears tonight. Wrapped in myth, wrapped in science, wrapped in sleep-soft words. What might you carry forward, without even realizing it, to whoever is listening 12,000 years from now? Maybe the answer is that you don't get to decide. Maybe what you carry forward isn't the grand, deliberate message you'd choose if someone handed you a cosmic clipboard and said, pick one message for the year 14,000. Maybe what survives is smaller. A lullaby, a proverb, a habit, the way your eyes drift to the sky whenever you feel uneasy, without even knowing why. We like to imagine that history is carried by spectacular objects, monuments, palaces, giant statues gazing down from cliffs. But when you look at what actually travels across vast stretches of time, it's often the quietest things. A story pattern that keeps returning in different clothes. A world, a disaster, a remnant who survives and starts again. A way of building. Stone on stone, aligned to the sun. That appears in Turkey, in Britain, in Ireland, in Egypt, in cultures that never met yet somehow arrived at similar answers to the problem of remembering. A fear of water that runs deeper than any single coastline, deeper than any one river. If you and I could trace your personal cultural ancestry backward, story by story, we'd eventually reach a point where the line stops being literature and starts being survival instruction. Don't build too close to the river. Store food when the sky looks like this. Pay attention to that star. Fire came once. It can come again. Over thousands of years, those pieces were polished into the myths we know. The gods arrived later. The survival code came first. And now, in our time, we're doing something that looks very different on the surface, but underneath, it might be the same old instinct. Have you ever heard of warning monuments for nuclear waste? It sounds like science fiction, but it's a real problem that real people sit in real rooms and try to solve. We've buried radioactive material in deep geological repositories, places meant to stay sealed for 10,000, even 100,000 years. That's longer than the age of any of our written languages. Longer than anything we can honestly promise. No government, no culture, no symbol system has stayed intact for that long. So the question becomes, how do you tell people very far into the future, do not dig here? This will hurt you. In a way, they'll still understand when your language, your politics, your entire civilization are dust. Some proposals sound almost mythical on purpose. A landscape of spikes, jagged, uncomfortable shapes that feel wrong to walk through. Dark, dead soil where nothing grows, carefully designed to trigger a gut-level unease. Huge carved faces twisted into expressions of sickness, pain, fear, a visual language to stay away that might still work even if all the words are gone. People have even suggested founding a special order of atomic priests, whose task would be to pass down knowledge of the danger through ritual and story, generation after generation, until the warning becomes religion. Imagine that. We, the hyper-rational, data-driven moderns, deliberately inventing a religion so that people in the year 30,000 won't build homes on top of a glowing tomb. It sounds bizarre, and yet that is almost exactly what our ancestors did in reverse. They encoded the memory of the Great Flood into gods and rites and sacred hills. They took practical knowledge and wrapped it in story, because story is what survives when everything else blows away. We look at a circle of stones and argue about whether it's a temple or a calendar. In the future, someone might look at a field of menacing concrete spikes and argue about whether it was a curse, a sculpture, or the remains of some forgotten punishment ground. What if they get it wrong? What if they read our warning monuments the way we may be reading Göbekli Tepe? Half right, half wrong, filling the gaps with our own assumptions. What if they turn them into pilgrimage sites, places of power where you go to get closer to the gods, never realizing that the gods, in this case, are isotopes with half-lives longer than their entire culture? There's a strange cosmic irony in that. We're trying to tell the future. Don't repeat our mistake. And we can't be sure we aren't creating new myths that will drift away from their original meaning in the same way flood stories did. And yet, what else can we do? Listening to all of this, you might feel a slow, creeping helplessness, a sense that everything is too big, cosmic impact streams, 10,000-year warning systems, sea level graphs that stretch beyond your lifetime. And here you are, a single person in a single room on a single night about to fall asleep. What possible role could you have in a story that long? Maybe more than it seems. Because civilizations don't act. Governments don't act. Companies don't act, not on their own. People act, one by one, choice after choice, until those actions pile up like grains in a dune and start to look like the work of some larger thing. The first person who suggested building stone circles aligned to the sun was just someone with an idea. The first person who said, "We should not forget what happened when the waters rose," was just an elder telling a child, "Let me tell you a story." The first person who carved a spiral and decided, "This means the cycle of the year," made a simple, quiet decision. You don't know their names, but you're living inside the echo of their choices right now, listening to a story about their story. In the same way, people far ahead of us may never know your name, but they may still live inside the echo of choices your time made or failed to make, not only on grand, planetary scales, whether we deflect asteroids, whether we stabilize the climate, but on local, intimate ones. Whether your city decides to rebuild after flood in the same vulnerable place, or a little higher on the hill. Whether your community chooses to remember a terrible storm as a freak accident, or as the first clear warning in a pattern. Whether your children grow up treating the sky as just a pretty blue ceiling, or as a living system that deserves attention. There's a quiet continuity between someone standing in a dewy field at dawn at Stonehenge, waiting for the sun to slide into an exact notch, and you glancing up from your phone when the weather app flashes record-breaking heat again this summer. Both are moments when a human being feels the edge of something larger, some long rhythm that doesn't care about our plans. The people at Stonehenge didn't have words like obliquity or axial precession. You might not either, not without stopping to think. But you share with them a feeling that the turning of a year, the behavior of the sun, the level of the river or the sea, matters in a deep, almost personal way. That's the thread. That's what has to be carried from age to age. Not the exact details of which comet, which crater, which meltwater pulse, but the understanding that we live inside a system with teeth. A beautiful system. The one that gives us sunsets and seasons, migrations and rain and snow, and also the one that sometimes throws fire and ice at us with no regard for our schedules. Our ancestors answered that with reverence and fear. We can answer it with reverence, fear, and knowledge. You don't have to hold all of that in your mind as you fall asleep. You don't have to become a walking encyclopedia of catastrophes. It's enough for now to let one simple awareness settle in. We have been through something like this before. We survived. We may go through something like it again. Our best chance is to remember that it's possible and to act like people who know the world can change fast. If that idea lives in you, even faintly, you're already part of the memory. And somewhere millennia from now, someone standing at a strange layer in the earth might feel a brief, quiet gratitude that we did not let the story die. Maybe the answer is that you don't get to decide. Maybe what you carry forward isn't the grand, deliberate message you choose if someone handed you a cosmic clipboard and said, choose one message of the year 14,000. Maybe what survives is smaller. A lullaby, a proverb, a habit, the way your eyes drift to the sky whenever you feel uneasy, without even knowing why. We like to imagine that history is carried by spectacular objects, monuments, palaces, giant statues gazing down from cliffs. But when you look at what actually travels across vast stretches of time, it's often the quietest things. A story pattern that keeps returning in different clothes. A world, a disaster, a remnant who survives and starts again. A way of building. Stone on stone, aligned to the sun. That appears in Turkey, in Britain, in Ireland, in Egypt, in cultures that never met yet somehow arrived at similar answers to the problem of remembering. A fear of water that runs deeper than any single coastline, deeper than any one river. If you and I could trace your cultural ancestry backward, story by story, we'd eventually reach a point where the line stops being literature and starts being survival instruction. Don't build too close to the river. Store food when the sky looks like this. Pay attention to that star. Fire came once. It can come again. Over thousands of years, those scraps of advice were polished into myths. The gods arrived later. The survival code came first. And now, in our time, we're doing something that looks very different on the surface, but underneath might come from the same instinct. Have you ever heard of warning monuments for nuclear waste? It sounds like science fiction, but it's a real problem that real people in real rooms try to solve. We've buried radioactive material in deep geological repositories, places meant to stay sealed for 10,000, even 100,000 years. That's longer than any written language has survived, longer than any government, any symbol system we know. So the question becomes, how do you tell people very far into the future, do not dig here, this will hurt you, in a way they'll still understand when your language, your politics, your entire civilization are dust? Some proposals sound deliberately mythical. A landscape of spikes, jagged, uncomfortable shapes that feel wrong to walk through. Dark, barren soil where nothing grows, carefully designed to trigger a gut-level unease. Huge car faces twisted into expressions of sickness, pain, fear, a visual language of stay away that might still work even if all the words are gone. People have even suggested founding a special order of atomic priests, whose task would be to pass down knowledge of the danger through ritual and story, generation after generation, until the warning becomes religion. Imagine that we, the hyper-rational, data-driven moderns, deliberately inventing a religion so that people in the year 30,000 won't build homes on top of a glowing tomb. It sounds bizarre, and yet it's almost exactly what our ancestors did in reverse. They encoded the memory of a great flood into gods and rites and sacred hills. They wrap practical knowledge in story because story is what survives when everything else blows away. We look at a circle of stones and argue about whether it's a temple or a calendar. In the future, someone might look at a field of menacing concrete spikes and argue about whether it was a curse, a sculpture, or the remains of some forgotten punishment ground. What if they get it wrong? What if they read our warning monuments the way we may be reading Göbekli Tepe? Half right, half wrong. Filling the gaps with our own assumptions. What if they turn them into pilgrimage sites? Places of power where you go to get closer to the gods, never realizing that the gods, in this case, are isotopes with half-lives longer than their entire culture. There's a strange cosmic irony in that. We're trying to tell the future. Don't repeat our mistake. And we can't be sure we aren't creating new myths that will drift away from their original meaning in the same way flood stories did. And yet, what else can we do? Thinking about all this, you might feel a slow, creeping helplessness, a sense that everything is too big. Cosmic impact streams, 10,000-year warning systems, sea level graphs that stretch beyond your lifetime. And here you are, a single person in a single room on a single night about to fall asleep. What possible role could you have in a story that long? Maybe more than it seems. Civilizations don't act. Governments don't act. Companies don't act. At least not on their own. People act. One by one. Choice after choice. Until those actions pile up like grains in a dune and start to look like the work of some larger thing. The first person who suggested aligning stones to the sun was just someone with an idea. The first person who said, "We should not forget what happened when the waters rose," was just an elder telling a child, "Let me tell you a story." The first person who carved a spiral and decided, "This means the turning of the year," made a simple, quiet decision. You don't know their names, but you're living inside the echo of their choices right now, listening to a story about their story. In the same way, people far ahead of us may never know your name, but they may still live inside the echo of choices your time made, or failed to make. Not only on planetary scales, whether we deflect asteroids, whether we stabilize the climate, but on local, intimate ones. Whether your city rebuilds after a flood in the same vulnerable place, or slightly higher on the hill. Whether your community remembers a terrible storm as a freak accident, or as the first clear warning in a pattern. Whether your children grow up seeing the sky as just a pretty blue ceiling, or as a living system that deserves attention. There's a quiet continuity between someone standing in a dewy field at dawn at Stonehenge, waiting for the sun to slip into an exact notch, and you glancing up from your phone when the forecast flashes record-breaking heat again this summer. Both are moments when a human being feels the edge of something larger, a long rhythm that doesn't care about our plans. The people at Stonehenge didn't have words like axial precession. You might not either, not without stopping to think. But you share with them the sense of the turning of the year, the behavior of the sun, the level of the river or the sea, matters in a deep, almost personal way. That's the thread. That's what has to be carried from age to age. Not the precise details of which comet, which crater, which meltwater pulse, but the understanding that we live inside a beautiful system with teeth. The same system that gives us sunsets and seasons, migrations and rain and snow, is also the one that sometimes throws fire and ice at us with no regard for our schedules. Our ancestors answered that with reverence and fear. We can answer with reverence, fear, and knowledge. You don't have to hold all of this in your mind as you fall asleep. You don't need to become a walking encyclopedia of catastrophes. It's enough for now to let one simple awareness settle in. We have been through something like this before. We survived. We may go through something like it again. Our best chance is to remember that it's possible and to act like people who know the world can change fast. If that idea lives in you, even faintly, you're already part of the memory. And maybe one day, someone brushing dust from that strange glittering layer will feel a brief, quiet gratitude that we did not let the story die. Somewhere far ahead, a child in a museum reads that little plaque about learning to live as good ancestors. And you, here in the dark, are one of the invisible reasons that sentence can honestly exist. Not because you personally move planets or redirect comets, but because you're doing something surprisingly rare. You're letting your mind stretch across 12,000 years without flinching. That might sound small. It isn't. Most animals live inside a window of hours or days. Some large, social creatures, whales, elephants, great apes, seem to remember decades. But as far as we know, only humans try to remember thousands of years back and thousands of years forward. That's our strange superpower. Not tools, not fire, not language, but memory that reaches beyond a single life. And when you look at the younger Dryas through that lens, it stops being an ancient disaster and becomes something else. A test we barely passed, and a lesson we're still figuring out how to integrate. Let yourself, just for a moment, picture a civilization that really learned that lesson. Not only in myth, where the flood becomes a story about morality and obedience, but in infrastructure, in habit, in the quiet assumptions of daily life. What would that look like? You can see them if you let your thoughts drift. Cities built not on the lowest, flattest land, but deliberately set back from the ocean, with wide sacrificial zones where the sea can move in and out without taking everything with it. Coastlines treated as negotiable borders, not as fixed property lines. Architecture that expects change. Houses designed to be disassembled and move when rivers shift. Modular towns that can climb a few meters up the valley without turning into ruins. Whole cultures that treat migration not as an emergency, but as a normal response to a restless planet. You can imagine them watching the sky, but with tools even our best telescopes would envy. A web of sensors out beyond Mars. Quiet machines looking inward, searching for any faint infrared whisper rocks that might cross Earth's path. When they find one, there's no panic, just a small adjustment. A nudge years or decades in advance, the gravitational equivalent of tapping a billiard ball. So it misses the pocket by a comfortable margin. For them, the younger Dryas isn't just a scary chapter in some dusty archive. It's the reason they fund that sensor network. The reason every child learns about orbital dynamics the way you learned your times tables. The reason their myths and movies and bedtime stories include not just dragons and ghosts, but comets and ice. We're not there. Not yet. But we've started taking the first awkward steps in that direction. We've tested in real space the idea that you can slam a spacecraft into an asteroid on purpose just to see if you can change its path. We've mapped tens of thousands of near-Earth objects and given them names and numbers instead of treating them as random streaks of light. We've pulled from ice and rocked the records of past climate flips and said we should probably not push the system the same direction with our exhaust pipes and smokestacks. We've begun to understand that the calm of the Holocene is not a birthright, but a lucky stretch of track on a roller coaster that runs much longer than our written history. All of that is very new. In cosmic terms, we're like a child who has just realized the ocean has tides, standing at the edge of the water trying to decide whether to keep building sandcastles in the same spot. It's easy, from that vantage point, to slip into a kind of vertigo, to feel that nothing you do could possibly matter against ice sheets and debris streams and 10,000-year swings. But look back, just for a moment, at the people who survived the younger Dryas. They didn't have models or impact surveys or global treaties. They had something far more rudimentary and yet, in its own way, just as powerful. They had each other. They had stories. They had a stubborn refusal to let the memory of what happened fade into silence. Everything else grew from that. Agriculture may have been, in part, a trauma response, a way of clawing back security after wild plants failed. Monuments may have been a kind of collective therapy. Stone grew projects that gave people meaning after their familiar landscapes were erased. Astronomy, in its earliest form, may have been a desperate attempt to find a pattern in the sky that had betrayed them. Out of those coping strategies came the building blocks of everything we now call civilization. And you, small, tired 21st century human trying to relax enough to sleep, are not separate from that. When you grow a tomato in a pot, when you check the weather forecast, when you marvel an eclipse, when you tell a child why the moon changes shape, you're doing scaled-down versions of those same things, taking an unpredictable world and making it feel a little more understandable, a little more survivable. There's another, stranger thought some scientists have raised, half curiosity and half caution. They ask, if some earlier civilization had existed on Earth millions of years before us, not human, not like us at all, but technologically capable, will we even know? The idea sometimes goes by the name the Silurian hypothesis. It's speculative, and so far the evidence points to no, nothing like that happened. But as a thought experiment, it's useful, because over millions of years, almost every direct artifact of a technological society would be erased. Metal returns to, or concrete crumbles back to sand. Plastic breaks into dust and sinks into sediment. Tectonic plates dive under each other. Mountains rise and wear away. Oceans open and close. After 10, 20, 50 million years, you might be left with only the faintest clues. Unusual chemicals in rock, odd isotopes in sediments, subtle shifts in fossils as climate and extinction pulses roll through. To even notice that, you'd need a civilization that thinks in geological time, that can read rock the way we read books. We are just beginning to become that civilization. We're the first species we know that can look back and say, there was a sudden temperature drop 12,900 years ago, followed by rapid warming, and here's how sea level and species and people responded. We're the first to ask whether our own industrial fingerprints will still be visible tens of millions of years from now. We're the first to wonder whether someone else might have left similar fingerprints long before us. So far, the rock is silent. No ancient plastic. No fossilized circuits. No clear, we were here from some forgotten species. As far as we can tell, we are the first to reach this particular, precarious ledge. That makes our situation feel heavier, but also, in a strange way, calm. There's no older, wiser civilization coming to rescue us. There are no parents on this planetary playground. It's just us, and a memory of one great flood and countless smaller storms. Inside that loneliness, though, there's a kind of freedom. We get to write the first true chapter of what a species does when it understands both the danger and the opportunity of being self-aware on a volatile world. We can decide to be loud and brief, a flash of fossil fuel and fireworks that ends in a thin dark line in the rock and a scattering of legends. Or we can decide to be quieter, longer lasting, a civilization that learns how to ride the cycles instead of amplifying them. Right now, on the scale of cosmic history, that decision is being made in a handful of centuries. A flicker, a breath. You are living in the middle of that flicker, not because you chose it, not because you signed up for it, but simply because that's when you were born. And that means that even the small shape of your attention, what you choose to learn, what you choose to care about, what stories you pass on, is part of a much larger turning that no one fully controls. You can experience it as pressure, or you can let it feel like a deep, odd kind of comfort. You don't have to save the world. You only have to be one more human who remembers that we've nearly lost it before. One more person who hears the phrase Great Flood and thinks of coral cores and black mats and drowned forests as well as arcs and rainbows. One more mind that holds, somewhere deep down, the knowledge that the sky is not just a backdrop. It's a participant. That might be the most important role any of us can play. To keep that awareness alive, softly, without panic, the way embers are kept under ash. So if you find yourself in the days ahead, looking up at a meteor shower or at a satellite sliding silently across the night, you might feel just a tiny shift, a sense of connection to people who watch the same sky from a world of ice and mammoths, and to people who will watch it from shorelines we haven't drawn yet. A sense that you're not just a bystander in a random present, but a bridge, a brief, bright link between a remembered flood and a future that might, if we're careful, never have to know that kind of drowning again. Let that thought soften now, its edges blurring like a shoreline seen through morning mist. The comets, the ice sheets, the rising seas, the stones on the hilltops and the data in the servers. They'll all still be there tomorrow. For tonight, you can let your breathing be the only tide that matters. In and out, slow and steady, like waves on a very quiet shore. The Great Flood was real. The world almost ended. Somehow, improbably we remain. And as you drift toward sleep, you carry with you the faint, persistent echo of a promise our ancestors made in stone. We will remember. We will tell you. We will give you a chance to do better than we did. The elder by the old river. We will remember. We will tell you. We will give you a chance to do better than we did. That was their promise. Not spoken in English or Sumerian or any language we can reconstruct, but in stone, in story, and in scar. And you, right now, half awake and half asleep, are the proof that it worked. Because here you are, carrying images of fire in ancient skies and drowned forests beneath modern seas, thinking about people who lived and died 12,000 years before you. That's memory doing its slow, miraculous work. Maybe, before you drift off, it helps to make this even more personal. Let's set aside the big maps for a moment, the ice sheets, the sea level graphs, the global surveys, and drop down into one small imagined scene. It's not a specific site we can point to on a chart. It's stitched together from bones and pollen and charcoal and climate records, from what we know for sure and what we gently infer. We'll keep those two piles separate in our minds, the known and the maybe. Picture a small river valley at the end of the Younger Dryas, somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, the region we now call the Levant, where we know from real excavations that people were gathering wild grains, living in semi-cell communities, building the first hints of villages. Science tells us that in places like Abu Huraira and Jericho, there were houses of mud brick, storage pits, grinding stones worn smooth by hands that turned seeds into flour. We know they grew barley and emmer wheat, that they hunted gazelle and wild boar, that they lived through the sharp cold and into the warming that followed. Those are the facts. What we don't know are their names or the sound of their laughter, the jokes they told, the exact stories they whispered to children at night. So let's gently imagine one of those evenings. We'll call our river the Old River, because all rivers are old. We won't give the people names, because any names we choose will be wrong, but the feelings will be roughly right. The day has been long. Grain has been cut with flint sickles. Straw dust still tickles inside of the nose. The air is warmer now, after generations of bitter winters. You sit with your family under a simple roof of reeds and mud, in the smell of smoke and grain, with the faint rustle of stored barley in baskets tucked against the wall. Outside, the river murmurs in the dark. You can't see it, but you can hear the water, as people always have. An elder, a grandmother perhaps, or a man whose hair has gone white while the climate has gone strange, begins to speak. She remembers colder years, leaner years. She remembers, as a child, when the snow stayed long on the hills, when the wind had teeth. She remembers stories from her own elders about a time before that, when the world was warmer, and before that, when fire fell. She doesn't say, a comet fragmented in the atmosphere, or fresh water disrupted the Atlantic circulation. She doesn't say Younger Dryas, because those words won't exist for more than 10,000 years. She says something like, the sky sent a serpent of fire, or the god above grew angry and threw stones that burned. She tells you the forest burned for many days, that the air turned to hot smoke, that the great animals ran, then lay down and did not rise again. Maybe she points toward the hills where your people sometimes find massive bones turned to stone, too large to belong to any creature you know. Maybe she tells you that long ago the river was lower or higher, or that the sea was farther away. She can't show you maps, but she can gesture with her hands and say, once, the water only came to here. Now it is there. She may not remember the sequence perfectly. The order of fire and ice and flood might have blurred. But the feeling is clear. The world can change. It has changed. It might change again. Then she does something crucial. She folds that warning into the fabric of your people's identity. She tells you that your ancestors survived because they listened, because they moved, because they stored grain, because they watched the sky. She tells you that forgetting is dangerous. Maybe she wraps it in a simple moral. Do not grow arrogant. Do not think the river is your servant. Do not mock the signs in the heavens. She is not a scientist. She is a carrier. And somewhere to the north, on a hill that will one day be called Göbekli Tepe, other carriers are turning similar memories into stone. That part is speculation. We don't know exactly which stories flowed into which monuments, but we know the pattern. Trauma becoming ritual, ritual becoming architecture, architecture becoming archaeology, archaeology becoming, for you, a quiet bedtime documentary. Thousands of years after that elder speaks, her valley may flood or fall silent, or grow into a city whose walls are now only faint lines on a satellite image. Her language will vanish. Her name will vanish. The mud brick walls will melt back into earth. But some shape of her story will travel. It will be told and retold, changing as it goes, like a river finding new channels each flood season. Maybe it becomes part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where a man is warned to build a boat before the waters come. Maybe it becomes part of some local legend that never makes it into writing, only into the memories of her great-great-grandchildren. Maybe it dissolves and leaves only a mood, a reflex to treat certain clouds or certain alignments of stars with deep, inherited unease. Whatever path it takes, a fragment of that evening by the old river is in you now. Because when you hear the flood came and wiped the world clean, you don't receive it only as fiction. Not entirely. Some part of you, rooted deeper than logic, recognizes that as a possible thing, a thing that has happened, a thing that could happen again in some form. That's why these stories stick. Not because they're comforting, they're actually frightening, but because they describe a real feature of our world, its ability to swing hard and then ask life to catch up. So when you listen now, you're not just being entertained. You're leaning into that old instinct, the one that kept your distant kin alive. Tell me what the world can do. Tell me what you've seen. Let me sleep tonight a tiny bit more prepared for the morning. The beautiful, almost unfair part is this. Your morning will be much calmer. No comet is tearing across your sky tonight. No ice sheet is collapsing outside your window. The oceans are rising, yes, but slowly enough that you can measure in centimeters over a human lifetime, not meters. You have time. Time our ancestors would have killed for, to think, to plan, to act deliberately instead of only reacting. And right now, you also have the right to do something they rarely could. To rest, to let your nervous system unclench a little, even while holding, somewhere in the background, the awareness that the world is bigger than you, but not indifferent to you. So as your breathing evens out, you can picture that elder by the old river finishing her story, the children at her feet already half asleep, the fire burning down the coals. Outside, the stars are where they should be. The river keeps its murmur. The air smells of grain and ash and damp earth. No one in that house knows your name or the shape of your world. But the line between you is unbroken. Their fear, their courage, their decision to remember instead of forget flows forward through centuries and languages and changing landscapes until it becomes a documentary script in your headphones on a night when you just wanted something slow and thoughtful to fall asleep to. You've honored their promise simply by listening. As your thoughts grow softer, less sharp around the edges, you can let all the big patterns, the comets, the ice ages, the drowned coasts, the monuments, drift a little farther away, like lights on a distant shore. What's left right here is simple. You're alive in a rare calm between storms. You come from survivors. You carry their memory, whether you mean to or not, and somewhere beyond your lifetime, someone may stand at our lair in the rock and feel, for just a moment, grateful that we remembered enough to give them time. For tonight, that's all you need to hold. The great flood was real. It passed. We remain. You can rest now. The great flood was real. It passed. We remain. You can rest now. But rest for humans has never meant complete silence. Even in sleep, your mind keeps turning, sorting, filing, wandering. Dreams are the brain's way of stitching experience into story. And in a way, that's what we've been doing with the younger Dryas all along. Dreaming about it again and again until the scattered pieces of ice, fire, and drowned land begin to form a kind of meaning. So before you drift all the way down, let's follow one more soft thread through this tapestry. We've talked a lot about the people who survived the flood, about what they built and what they remembered. But there's another character that's been here the whole time, quiet and patient, recording everything, the ocean. If you want a really long memory, longer than stone, longer than ice, you go to the sea. Sediments on the seafloor build up like pages in a book. Plankton shells rain down. Dust blows in from deserts. Ash falls from volcanoes. Pollen drifts offshore from forests and fields. All of it settles, layer after layer, down into the slow, dark quiet. We've only just begun to read those pages. In the last few decades, ships have crossed and recrossed the deep, dropping hollow tubes to bite into the mud. They haul up long cylindrical cores, striped in muted browns and grays. Inside those bands are clues to ancient climates, storms, floods, and river plumes loaded with silt from the moments when coastlines drowned. Somewhere under the North Sea, beneath the Sunda Shelf, beneath what was once the Persian Gulf oasis, lie sediments that remember the exact moments those landscapes went under. We haven't found all of them yet. We probably won't for a long time. But imagine what it will be like when we do. Picture a research vessel on a calm day in a not-so-distant future. The water is still, the sky a high, pale blue. On deck, a small group of scientists and crew gathers around a fresh core lifted from a drowned shelf. They crack it open, careful as surgeons, and there in the layers they see it, a sudden change. Below are river sediments, fine silts from a delta that existed there when the sea was much lower, traces of plant material, bits of charcoal, grains of pollen from trees and grasses that no longer grow in that place. Above is marine mud and tiny shells of ocean plankton, the unmistakable signal that the shoreline left inland, turning land into seafloor. Right at the boundary, there's a rush of coarser grains, evidence of fast, violent flooding as waves and tides bit into newly submerged ground. Maybe there are tiny artifacts mixed in, a flake of flint, a fragment of burned charcoal washed from a camp as the last fire went out underwater. They'll be able to date that moment with exquisite precision. Someone will say, this is when Doggerland died, or this is when the Persian Gulf Basin filled. Then they'll compare that date to coral cores from Tahiti, to ice from Greenland, to flood myths preserved in old texts, and see how neatly the pieces slide into place. The story you've been listening to tonight will become, for them, not a fringe idea or speculative thread, but part of standard history. It will live in textbooks, not in a mystical chapter full of talk about Atlantis, but in calm, steady language. During the last deglaciation, a sudden cooling event known as the Younger Dryas interrupted the warming trend. At its onset, there's evidence for unusual cosmic dust and extensive fires. At its close, a rapid sea level rise inundated vast coastal plains, likely contributing to widespread flood traditions. Children will read that the way you learned about dinosaurs or Roman roads, simply as something that happened. All the arguments and puzzles that feel so vivid to us now will be footnotes. They may look back at us with the same fond exasperation we feel when we read 19th century scientists insisting that rocks couldn't possibly fall from the sky. Meteorites? Impossible. But they learned. We will too. And yet, no matter how refined the data becomes, no matter how clean the graphs, there will always be a part of the Younger Dryas that refuses to be fully pinned down, because the core of it doesn't just live in sediments and isotopes. It lives in feelings. In the shock of waking to find a familiar landscape made strange, in the grief of realizing a way of life is gone for good, in the eerie sense that the world itself can change its mind. Those feelings aren't locked in the deep past. They echo in smaller ways whenever a town is wrecked by a storm, whenever a fire takes a forest people thought they knew, whenever a pandemic rearranges everyday life faster than anyone was ready for. The scale shifts, the timeline compresses, but the emotional pattern stays the same. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not now. The people who built monuments after the flood were doing what we do after our own disasters. Making meaning. We hold memorials, write books, build museums, change laws. They raised stones, reshaped myths, shifted where and how they lived. All of it is an attempt to take something chaotic and cruel and weave it into a story that lets us go on. So if sometimes when you read the news, you feel that dull, overwhelmed sensation, the sense that the ground under your assumptions is less solid than you thought, you are not failing. You're just feeling in miniature what our species has felt many times on larger scales. We are, and always have been, a creature learning to live with a restless planet. The Younger Dryas was the loudest reminder that in the span of our memory so far, the great flood that nearly erased the page, then handed the pen back to a shocked, shivering remnant and said, "Try again." Everything since, agriculture, cities, writing, science, the device you're using now, is part of that second draft. It will not be the last draft, but if we're lucky and a little attentive, it might be the first one that leaves clear, deliberate guidance for whoever writes the third. You don't have to hold all of that in your thoughts as you fall asleep. You can let it sink down into the quieter layers of your mind, where long stories live, Up here, near waking, you only need one simple thing in view. You belong to a species that has already come back from the edge once. You live in the calm that followed a world-shaking storm. And just by listening, by caring enough to let that history brush against you on a night like this, you're helping keep the oldest, most important warning we've ever received from fading away. The flood came. The flood passed. We remain. And now you can finally let your own inner tide recede into sleep. The flood came. The flood passed. We remain. And yet, if you're still here, if your eyes aren't quite closed, we can take one more slow step together. Because there's one last perspective we haven't really visited yet. And it might be the most calming of all. We've been looking at the younger dryas in the ground. From rivers and hilltops, from drowned plains and carved stones. But what happens if we imagine stepping outside all of that for a moment and looking at Earth the way a very distant observer might? Not from an airplane, or even from a moon, but from much, much farther away. Picture it. A small, pale blue planet, not special at first glance. One of many worlds circling one of many stars, in one of many arms of one quiet galaxy. From that distance, you don't see cities or monuments. You don't see the fine shape of coastlines. You don't hear myths or read inscriptions. You just see patterns, swirls of cloud, pale polar caps, the browns and greens of continents turning slowly in and out of sunlight. If you had a patient telescope that watched for a very long time, you'd notice those ice caps don't stay the same. They grow and shrink. White creeps farther down over northern land masses for tens of thousands of years, then retreats. See, ice spreads across the oceans, then pulls back. At certain intervals, those changes happen very fast. From that cosmic distance, the younger dryas will be one of those quick flickers, a sudden brightening of white at the poles, a change in the patterns of cloud and heat, and then a rapid reverse, a warming, a thinning of ice, a subtle expansion of dark blue ocean. You wouldn't hear mammoths bellowing or trees cracking in wildfires. You wouldn't see people fleeing up valleys ahead of rising water. You'd just see a planet doing what planets do, swinging a little, rebalancing, testing the resilience of life wrapped around it. From that vantage point, our dramas, our floods, our resets, our great monuments, are tiny ripples on a much larger sea that can feel humbling, almost to the point of disappearing. If we're that small, some part of you might whisper, does anything we do really matter? If you listen a little longer, a quieter answer comes back. Yes, we're small in space. Yes, we're brief in time. But sheer scale doesn't erase meaning. Your consciousness, this flicker of awareness that can hold, in a single thought, both a mammoth on a frozen plain 12,000 years ago and a child in a future museum 12,000 years from now, is part of what makes this particular planet strange and precious. We know, factually, that the universe is vast, billions of galaxies, billions of stars, probably trillions of planets. We suspect, but don't yet know, that some of those worlds may host life, maybe even minds that can remember and imagine, fear and hope, tell stories about floods and fire. So far, though, the only place we're certain this has happened is here, on this small, stormy world that carries, in its rocks and oceans, the memory of the younger dryas and 1,000 other upheavals. If you zoom back in now, down to the atmosphere, past the clouds, over dark forests and the scattered lamps of cities, back to the room you're in, you're returning to a very rare vantage point. You are not just watching the planet. You are the planet, in a tiny, local, temporary form, watching itself. When you think about ice ages and comet streams and drowned coastlines, that's Earth becoming aware of its own patterns. When you feel a flicker of worry about rising seas, that's the ocean, in a roundabout way, worrying about itself, because your lungs and its waves are part of the same circulation of water and air. When you feel tenderness for people in the past who suffered through the Great Flood, that's life on this world showing kindness to its earlier versions. It sounds poetic, but in a simple biological sense it's true. Your blood contains atoms that once fell as those ancient rains. Your bones are built from elements forged in the cores of stars that burned and died long before Earth existed. Your thoughts are electrochemical flickers running along pathways that evolved to the same trial and error process that gave mammoths their fur and birds their wings. So when you remember, when you care, when you try to be a good ancestor, you're not doing something separate from nature. You're doing something nature invented here. For the first time we know of long memory and long concern. Science gives us the bones of that idea. We know neurons ourselves. We know stories are patterns of activity. We know everything you feel has a physical basis. Speculation adds a gentle maybe. Maybe this is how a planet learns not to hurt itself quite so badly next time. Maybe the Great Flood 12,000 years ago was not only a tragedy, but a training ground for a kind of awareness that only emerges when a species has been nearly erased once. We can't prove that. It's an idea, a way of looking. But it's a soothing one, because it means your late-night thoughts about ancient disasters aren't just morbid curiosity. They're part of a larger healing process. Not only for you, but for this whole, slightly bruised world. You're helping, in your own tiny corner, to integrate a trauma older than writing. We don't know if other planets with other minds have gone through similar cycles. We know, from telescopes, that Mars once had water and now is dry, that Venus may have been gentler before runaway heat turned it into a furnace. We can imagine, but not yet prove, what stories their rocks would tell if they could speak. Here on Earth, we're lucky. Our rocks, our ice, our coral, our DNA, our myths, they all talk at once. And if we listen carefully, they tell us something very simple, very old, and very relevant to your next breath. Everything changes. Sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, sometimes in ways that erase whole landscapes and entire ways of life. But within that change, there's continuity. Not of buildings or borders or specific stories, those come and go, but a stubborn thread of life try to remember enough to do better next time. Tonight you follow that thread back through one great flood. You've looked at black mats and drowned plains, ghost populations and hilltop stones, and you've let it all settle into the quiet part of you that holds big, slow truths. You don't have to do anything more with it. You don't have to solve it or turn it into a plan. It's enough that you know now, in a way you maybe didn't before, that when you hear about a mythical flood, you'll feel a small, steady voice inside say, "That happened. We lived through it. We learned from it. The flood came. The flood passed. We remain." And in the soft dark around you now, where ancient oceans and newborn stars and old stories all blur into one slow-breathing universe, you can finally let your eyes close, let your thoughts drift, and let the long memory of our world hold you, the way the sea holds every river that ever flows into it. Rediscovers the flood. If the long memory of our world can hold you the way the sea holds every river, then in the morning, whenever your morning comes, you'll wake into a world that is still quietly piecing the story together. Because here's something almost funny, in a gentle, human way. The Younger Dryas, this vast, terrifying, species-shaping catastrophe, was completely unknown to us until just a few decades ago. For most of our written history, we had no idea that 12,900 years ago the climate slammed into reverse, that 11,600 years ago the seas lurched upward, that the world our myths half remember was drawn and then erased long before Sumer, long before pyramids, long before anyone wrote anything down. Plato told a story about Atlantis. Priests in Egypt told stories about floods. Scribes in Mesopotamia pressed the tale of Utnapishtim into clay. Temple readers recited the story of Noah. But none of them, not one, knew the dates or the ice cores or the meltwater pulses. For that, we had to wait until humans invented an entirely new kind of storytelling. Science. That word can sound cold and clinical, full of fluorescent light and white coats and graphs. But if you zoom out, science is just another way of doing what that elder by the river did. Sitting together and saying, "This is what we think happened," and then letting others test that story against their own experience. So how did we first notice that something strange had happened at the end of the last ice age? It started, as so many discoveries do, with people simply paying attention to things that didn't quite fit. Geologists in the 19th and early 20th centuries mapped old shorelines, glacial deposits, moraines, and meltwater channels. They already knew that ice ages were real, that vast glaciers had once covered big swaths of North America and Europe. They could see the scars in the landscape, U-shaped valleys, scoured bedrock, erratic boulders dropped by retreating ice like forgotten luggage. What they didn't know was how fast things had shifted, or that there had been this one particularly vicious snapback right at the end. That part only emerged when we learned to drill ice. Imagine the first time someone pulled a long, perfect cylinder of ice off from the Greenland sheet and realized they were holding a frozen, year-by-year diary of the atmosphere. Tiny bubbles of ancient air trapped in each layer, like little time capsules. You can almost picture the excitement in those labs. What if we could actually read this? They measured the composition of the gases, the ratios of different forms of oxygen, and slowly a temperature curve appeared. A line wandering left and right across tens of thousands of years. Mostly, it moved slowly, up during warm periods, down during deep glaciations. And then, right near the end of the last ice age, the line jumps down fast. This is the Younger Dryas, though they didn't call it that at first, just a mysterious cold snap. Later, pollen cores taken from lake sediments in Europe and the Middle East confirmed the same pattern. Plant communities that had been creeping north with a warming climate suddenly reversed. Cold-loving species rushing back in like a tide. Bits of charcoal showed spikes of fire. Bones of megafauna piled up below a certain layer, and then thinned to almost nothing above it. It was like watching the same drama from different angles. Ice, mud, bone, all agreeing that something big happened right there. And this is where our modern argument begins. Because science is not a single voice declaring certainty. It's a chorus, sometimes harmonious, sometimes dissonant, usually somewhere in between. One group looks at the evidence and says, this looks like a massive disruption of ocean currents caused by fresh water pouring into the North Atlantic. We know glacial lakes existed. We know they sometimes drain catastrophically. We don't need anything from space to explain this. Another group looks at the platinum spikes, the nanodiamonds, the melt glass, the black mats, and says, maybe, but these signatures look like high-temperature events not easily explained by climate alone. We see patterns consistent with airbursts, impacts, and influx of cosmic material. Back and forth they go, through papers and conferences, through quietly intense lab work. One team sifts sediments and finds no trace of impact markers in a particular core. Another team looks elsewhere and finds them in abundance. Some suggest the cosmic signatures are contamination or misinterpretation. Others refine their methods, tighten their controls, and return with cleaner signals. It's messy, and from the outside it can look like chaos, like no one knows anything. But if you stay with it long enough, you start to see that the argument itself is a kind of careful dance. Everyone is really asking the same question: what's the simplest story that fits all these clues? It may turn out that the Younger Dryas had multiple triggers. An already unstable climate teetering on the edge gets a shove from a colossal pulse of fresh water. Fire on land and dust in the air change how the planet absorbs sunlight. Maybe there's a cosmic component. A swarm of fragments joining in like percussion in an already noisy orchestra. Or maybe after more careful work, some of those cosmic hints will fade, and we'll realize our first interpretation was too dramatic. That's the humbling part of watching science unfold in real time. You rarely get final answers. You get drafts, revisions, slowly sharpening pictures, and the courage to say, we were wrong about that detail. Here's a better fit. Think about how different that is from myth. A myth, once it settles, is usually treated as fixed. You don't revise the flood of Noah every time a new sediment core is drilled. But science insists on being willing to be wrong. Myth gives you meaning. Data gives you correction. Somewhere between them, if you're patient, they can meet. And that's really where you've been resting tonight, in that meeting place, in the courtyard between temple and lab, where elders and researchers are both in their own ways, just trying to tell the truest story they can about what the world has done before and what it might do again. If you could walk through that courtyard in the morning, you'd see ice core technicians filtering ancient meltwater. You'd see archaeologists brushing soil from a flint blade at the edge of a drowned river channel. You'd see astronomers tracking dark rocks in sunlit space, eyes a little tired but steady. And maybe on the steps, you'd see a storyteller with a notebook or a microphone, turning all those careful measurements back into something a tired mind can hold at night. Something like this, a loop of memory, circling from myth to rock to data, and back to myth, each pass a little closer to what really happened. You don't have to choose between them. You know, you can let Noah and Gobekli Tepe and black mats and platinum spikes all exist in the same mental landscape. Different layers of the same truth. The Great Flood was myth, yes, but it was also history in geology and climate science. It was a story and a strata and a scar. And now it's part of your story too. When you wake, the arguments will still be ongoing. New cores will be drilled. New simulations will run. New underwater surveys will scan drowned valleys with sonar and light. Someone, somewhere, will write a paper that nudges the picture a little this way or that. And someday, not so far from now, children will learn a cleaner version of all this as settled fact. But you, falling asleep here, get the more interesting version. The one where the ink is still wet, the one where questions are still open, the one where your own imagination is allowed to walk beside the data and ask, what if? What if the comet hypothesis is partly right? What if we do find clear impact craters that line up perfectly with the black mats? What if we don't? And we have to accept that our catastrophe was homegrown, a feedback loop within the climate system itself. No cosmic scapegoat at all. What if, under some forgotten seabed, there's a campsite perfectly preserved in silt, with fire pits and fish bones, and a carved piece of wood that tells us, in some yet unread language, how it felt when the water came? Those are all maybes. Gentle ones. The kind that don't demand an answer before you sleep. You can set them down now like stones beside a path, knowing they'll still be there if you ever want to pick them up again. For tonight, all you really need to carry is the simplest form of this very long story. Once, not so long ago in Earth's time, the world lurched. It burned and froze and drowned. We nearly vanished. We did not. We remembered, clumsily but stubbornly, in myths and stones and ice. And you, right here, are part of that remembering. The flood came. The flood passed. We remain. Now let the words grow quieter in your mind, like footprints filling with wind-blown sand, and let sleep, deep and slow, rise around you like a very gentle tide. When that very gentle tide of sleep finally lets you drift away, something else keeps going. The story, not this particular arrangement of words, which will fade from your memory the way most dreams do, but the deeper pattern beneath it, the part of you that's been quietly practicing how to think in longer arcs. And when you surface again, whenever that is, the world will be exactly as precarious and ordinary as it was before you close your eyes. Cars will still move along streets. Messages will still wait in inboxes. The ice will still be shrinking a little. The seas rising a little. The sky as serene and complicated as ever. You won't walk out the door thinking, ah yes, the younger dryas, meltwater post 1b, black mats, and nano diamonds. You'll think about coffee and what you have to do today. And that's okay, because the point of touching this very long, very old story isn't to keep it perched on the surface of your mind every waking second. It's to let it settle, like fine silt, on the floor of your awareness, where it can quietly shift how you feel about things without demanding constant attention. Before you ever learned about plate tectonics, mountains were just big, solid, permanent things. After you learn that they rise and fall on timescales too slow to see, that continents drift, that stone flows, you didn't start walking around paralyzed by thoughts of subduction zones. You just carried, somewhere in the back of your mind, a softer sense that even the most solid things can move. This is like that, but with time, danger, and resilience. Now you know, in a slightly more visceral way, that humans have lived through abrupt planetary scale change before. You know that myths of a great flood aren't only metaphors. They're blurry reflections of something that really happened to people who were, in every essential way, just like you. You know the calm we live in now is not the default, but a lucky chapter. You don't have to obsess over that. You don't have to catastrophize. You just have to let it nudge one small dial inside you. The dial that controls how seriously you take the future. Not the next quarter, not the next election cycle, but the next few hundred, few thousand years. The stretch of road where our choices now still echo. It's tempting, in the face of those big numbers, to shrug and say, well, none of that will happen while I'm alive. And in a narrow sense, that's probably true. You will likely not stand on a shoreline watching the ocean leap 10 meters in a single lifetime. You will probably not watch an ice sheet collapse with your own eyes. You probably won't look up and see a sky lit by a torrid firestorm bright enough to turn midnight into noon. But the people who did, 12,000 years ago also didn't expect it the month before it happened. One generation grew up in a world warming, softening. Their children inherited a world sliding back into ice. One generation lived with familiar coasts. Their children watched those coasts turn into bays and seafloor. The shock for them was the speed. For you, the shock will be the awareness. The fact that you can see the outlines of possible futures before they fully arrive. You have early warning signs they never did, graphs, models, telescopes, satellites. And in a strange way, you have their stories, which are also early warnings, just wrapped in older cloth. So, what do you do with that double warning? From data and from myth? You don't need to answer that like a policymaker. You don't need a 10-point plan as you lie here in the dark. Maybe the answer, for now, is much smaller. Maybe it's simply learning to hold two timescales at once. This day, with its tasks and worries and small joys, and that deep time river we've been floating along, where 12,000 years is just a bend in the current. You can move between them without getting lost. When you wash dishes, you don't have to think about comets. When you watch a thunderstorm, you don't have to narrate it as a microcosm of climate systems. But sometimes when you look at the sea or the night sky, or a very old tree, you might feel a gentle, wordless connection to the people who looked at those same things under very different conditions. Not guilt, not doom, just kinship. You might find yourself, unexpectedly, being a little kinder to future people you'll never meet, choosing, in small ways, to be the kind of ancestor you wish you'd had, someone who thought ahead, someone who took the long view, someone who listened to warnings carved in stone and written in ice. And if enough of us make enough of those tiny adjustments, the big patterns can shift in surprisingly large ways. That's speculation, of course, a hopeful maybe, but there is some precedent. Once, nearly all human cultures took flood myths literally. The world had been drowned. The gods had done it. We were at their mercy. Now, slowly, we're rereading those stories through the lens of geology. We're starting to see that the gods can also mean the physics of a tilted, spinning planet in a messy, debris-filled solar system. We haven't stripped the stories of meaning. We've deepened them. Noah can now be both a symbol of faith and a symbol of resilience in the face of climate chaos. Atlantis can be both a cautionary tale about hubris and a poetic echo of drowned continental shelves. Ragnarok can be both an end-of-the-world myth and a memory of fire and ice trading places in violent rhythm. That's what happens when a civilization starts to grow up a little. It doesn't stop telling stories. It starts telling them with more layers. You're living right in the middle of that layering process. Older interpretations and newer ones sit side by side, sometimes arguing, sometimes quietly shaking hands. You're allowed, if you want, to be a person who holds both. To feel awe at a rainbow after a storm and also know about refraction and droplets. To feel awe at a night sky full of myths and also know about spectra and redshift. To feel awe at the idea of a great flood and also know about meltwater pulses, coral cores, and seafloor sediments. Awe doesn't get smaller when you add understanding. It just gets more stable, less fragile, less likely to shatter the first time someone shows you a graph. So as this chapter of the story quiets down, you can let yourself lean into that kind of awe, the calm, roomy kind that doesn't demand belief or disbelief, only attention. You walk from fire in the sky to black bands of soil, from mammoths on frozen plains to coral racing upward, from ghost DNA to hilltop stones and far future museums. You've seen how a single climatic lurch echoed through bones and myths and architecture in your own late-night thoughts. The details will blur. They're allowed to. What will remain, if anything does, is the sense that you are part of a much longer arc, one that bends slowly and unevenly toward greater awareness. Awareness of danger, yes, but also awareness of capacity. We are not helpless animals caught in a random storm. We are descendants of people who walked through that storm, left us clues, and gave us tools they never had. It would be a shame not to use them, but that is work for daylight. For now, you've done enough just by listening, imagining, and letting yourself feel both the fragility and the endurance we've inherited. The Great Flood was real. It passed. We remain. And somewhere deep in your brain, deeper than words, that simple truth has already found its place, settling like a small, Smooth stone at the bottom of a very quiet river. That small, smooth stone at the bottom of the river. Let's sit with that a little longer. Because if there's one image worth carrying out of this long, meandering journey, it might be that a quiet weight of knowing, resting where the current slows, not demanding anything of you, just being there. Not everyone gets that stone. Most people, through most of history, never had the chance to know what actually happened 12,000 years ago. They knew something terrible was lodged in their past. They felt it the way a family feels a shadow of an old disaster long after the details have faded. They had flood stories, fire from the sky stories, stories about a world that was different before. But no one could point to an ice core and say, here, this is when the temperature dropped 10 degrees in a human lifetime. No one could tap a graph and say, this is when the seas rose 7 to 13 meters in a few centuries. No one could overlay global maps and show exactly which coasts were lost, which plains were drowned, which rivers became bays. They had feelings and fragments. You have those, plus evidence. That doesn't make you superior. It just means you carry an extra tool they didn't have. You can hold the myth of the flood and the measurements of the flood in the same mind without one erasing the other. That's rare on a cosmic scale. And it's part of what makes this particular moment in our story so delicate and so important. Because for the first time, the species that nearly died in that ancient whiplash can understand what happened well enough to anticipate similar risks before they arrive. We won't see everything. Surprises are still possible. The universe is very good at throwing curveballs. But compared to the people standing on those lost coasts, watching the water creep toward their fires, we are astonishingly well informed. We can watch ice sheets from orbit and see where they're thinning, where cracks spider outward toward the sea. We can measure the composition of air from Antarctica to the upper atmosphere and see, in real time, how our exhaust nudges the planet's thermostat. We can track rocks in space down to the size of mountains, and we're getting better at spotting the smaller ones, the city breakers, the ocean splashers. We can drill sediments in drowned river mouths and pull up, layer by layer, the history of past floods. In a sense, we are the first generation to have the option of becoming conscious of the flood cycle before it hits again. That doesn't mean we will. Knowing is not the same as acting, and acting is not the same as choosing wisely. But the option is there, and that's where that little stone at the bottom of your mental river comes in. You don't have to become a full-time watcher of doom, staring at climate models and asteroid surveys until your nerves fray. You don't have to carry the weight of the whole planet in your chest. What you can do is let a slow, quiet awareness be part of who you are, to know that stable coasts are temporary, that climates can jump, that skies can misbehave, and, just as importantly, to know that humans can survive things that feel unsurvivable. Think about how strange it is that your DNA carries a record of bottlenecks, sharp squeezes in population size when our species was reduced to a fraction of itself, and yet, looking around you now, you wouldn't guess it. Cities, highways, languages, art, 8 billion people. From a distance, it looks like a smooth climb. Only when you zoom in do you see the cliffs. The Younger Dryas was one of those cliffs. The fact that we're here looking back at it means we climbed it. And that means something for you, personally, even if you never see anything of that magnitude in your own lifetime. It means resilience is not an abstract concept. It's literally what you're made of, not just in a motivational poster sense, but in the lineage sense. You come from people who endured droughts and freezes, floods and plagues, fires and famines. You come from people who lost everything familiar and still found ways to laugh, to love, to teach their children, to mark the seasons, to make meaning. If they hadn't, you wouldn't be here. This isn't meant to guilt you into feeling grateful all the time. It's meant to give you a quiet confidence that whatever life throws at you, on a much smaller, more personal scale, you have deeper resources than you think. The same species that walked through the Younger Dryas is the one that will walk through your particular hardships. The same kind of brain that figured out which plants to gather in a failing climate is the kind of brain that can learn new skills, adopt new habits, find new communities when old plans crumble. Your troubles are real and unique. They're not diminished by comparison to ice sheets and firestorms. But knowing what we've lived through as a whole can lend perspective when your own waves feel too high. I am the descendant of survivors. You can murmur to yourself if you ever need to. Somewhere far back, my family watched the world nearly end. They kept going. So can I. It's a small mantra, but it's built on 12,000 years of evidence. And if enough of us carry that kind of grounded, non-panicked awareness, then the big, shared choices we make together might tilt just a little toward wisdom. Maybe we build in safer places. Maybe we waste less. Maybe we track the sky more carefully. Maybe we treat the oceans and the ice less like scenery and more like organs in the body we live inside. Those are large-scale things, of course, but they start with small adjustments, one person at a time, one quiet realization at a time. Like this one, you didn't come here for a lecture or a call to action. You came for a story to fall asleep to, and yet in listening, you've let your mind practice something rare and valuable. Seeing yourself not just as a point in the present, but as a link in a long chain. If that's all that happens, it's already enough. So as your thoughts finally begin to blur and stretch and dissolve into whatever dreams wait for you tonight, you can let this story do what all good flood stories have always tried to do. Not to scare you, not to shame you, but to remind you that change is inevitable, that forgetting is dangerous, and that remembering is a kind of love. Love for the people behind you, who endured more than you will ever know. Love for the people ahead of you, who will live in a world shaped by what we do now. Love for this odd, beautiful, volatile planet that nearly shook us off once and then gave us another chance. The Great Flood was real. It passed. We remain. And now, with the long memory that settled like a stone in the quietest part of you, you can finally, fully, let go of the day, trust the night to hold you, and drift down into sleep. If you're somehow still awake, if sleep is hovering just out of reach like a shoreline wrapped in mist, we can walk a little farther yet. We've spent so much time on one cliff in our history, that sudden drop and rise 12,000 years ago, that it's easy to forget there were other edges too, older and fainter in our memory, but carved just as deeply into the bones of our species. The Younger Dryas wasn't the first time the world nearly lost us. Long before mammoths thundered across Doggerland, long before Göbekli Tepe rose on its lonely hill, there was another fire, another winter, another bottleneck that almost pinched us out. This one didn't come from the sky. It came from below. Imagine, if you can, a world 70 or 80,000 years ago. Our kind already exists, anatomically modern humans, people who, if you pass them on the street now, would look entirely ordinary to you. They've left tools, beads, traces of ochre paint. They've learned to cook food, to care for their young, to mourn their dead. They live mostly in Africa, with small, bold outposts perhaps already pushing into the Middle East, following coasts and rivers, hunting antelope, gathering roots and fruits, looking up at a sky full of familiar stars and unfamiliar dangers. Then somewhere in what is now Indonesia, a mountain tears itself open. We call it the Toba eruption. We know about it from ash layers spread across the Indian Ocean, from tiny shards of glass embedded in sediments thousands of kilometers away, from the quiet ring of lake that now fills the caldera. We don't know exactly what it felt like to live through it, whether people heard the first deep growls days before the final blast, whether they saw the sky bruise with ash-dark clouds gathering on the horizon. But we do know it was big, one of the largest eruptions our species has ever shared a planet with. Ash would have risen tens of kilometers into the stratosphere, spreading a thin veil around the globe. Sunlight dimmed, temperatures dipped, rain patterns shifted, plants faltered, animals followed. In the genetic record, it looks like a narrow place, a sudden thinning in the diversity of our line. Some studies suggest our entire species may have shrunk to a few thousand breeding pairs, scattered in pockets of refuge along coasts where shellfish still clung to rocks, in valleys where kind microclimates held just enough warmth and moisture for plants to endure. Others argue the bottleneck was softer, more spread out in time. As with the Younger Dryas, we don't have one clean, final answer. But the pattern is familiar. A world we thought we understood lurched, and we were almost not ready. Think of that for a moment as you lie here in the soft dark. Somewhere in your DNA, there are whispers from people who lived through volcanic winters so long ago that their names, their languages, their gods have vanished completely. You carry their victory. Not a triumphant, heroic victory. Nothing cinematic. Just a quiet success of not dying, of finding enough food, of sheltering the next generation through bad years, of adapting to a different sky. The younger Dryas, much later, was another test, another narrowing. Between these events and others we barely glimpsed, our species was shaped by repeated lessons. This planet is not static. Comfort is borrowed, not guaranteed. The roof can crack. The river can leap its banks. The air itself can change its mind. If you zoom out even further, beyond Toba and the younger Dryas and all the smaller storms that came and went, you start to see another pattern beneath it all, slow and vast, like the turning of a wheel. Ice ages, not just one, but many, beating in and out like a planetary heart. We now know from orbital calculations and sediment records that Earth's climate is tugged and tuned by subtle shifts in its dance. The tilt of its axis, the wobble of its spin, the shape of its path around the sun. Over tens of thousands of years, these cycles tip the balance between long, deep freezes and shorter, gentler warm periods. We live, right now, in one of those warm pulses, a Holocene interlude, a breathing space between glacial chapters. Left to itself, without our extra carbon, the planet would, in some tens of thousands of years, likely have slid slowly back toward ice. Maybe, far in the future, it still will, after our fossil fuel flare has faded from the air and the long, slow orbital rhythms reassert themselves. You can imagine future humans, or whatever descend from us, standing at the edge of a growing ice sheet, knowing, because they have our records, that we once lived in a world much like theirs, and that before that we lived in a world brutally different. They might read, in archives we can't yet build, about the younger Dryas and the Toba winter and all the other near misses. They'll know more than we do about how those stories fit together. They'll see patterns we can't yet see. And they'll add their own chapters to the story of fire and frost, flood and remembrance. It's a strange comfort, isn't it, to think that our fears and efforts and mistakes are just one layer in a much thicker book that other minds later on will be able to read us the way we read ice, and maybe feel tenderness for our clumsiness. You are allowed, right now, to be one of the clumsy ones, to not know exactly how to balance your short life against long risks, to feel small and sometimes overwhelmed and sometimes oddly calm as you listen to these stories. That's part of the process. The people who walked away from Tobas as didn't understand supervolcanoes. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe didn't understand orbital mechanics or Milankovitch cycles. We don't fully understand our own role in the next great turning. But in each case, somebody looked up, looked around, and decided to care beyond their own span, to leave some trace, some warning, some gift. For the Toba survivors, that gift was mostly biological. Adaptations, immune systems, instincts for cooperation. For the younger Dryas survivors, it was fragments of story, monuments, seedbeds of agriculture, early experiments in settled life. For us, it might be something as simple as more complete knowledge handed forward intact. Data not lost, lessons not erased. Maybe someday, long after you and I are gone, a child will listen to a calm, late-night voice talking about a different crisis in a different age and feel the same mixture of unease and comfort you feel now. Unease, because the world can change so fast. Comfort, because somehow, again and again, we have found ways to keep going. You don't have to solve the next 12,000 years tonight. You don't even have to stay awake for the end of this sentence. You can let all of this, Toba and ice ages and orbits and oceans, recede to the edges of your awareness, like mountains seen from a moving train. What stays with you can be very small, a sense that you are not alone in your worries, a sense that long before you, others face even sharper edges and left you, without knowing you, the possibility of a gentler life. The flood came, the fires burned, the ice advanced and retreated. We remain. And now, finally, you can let that smooth, small stone at the bottom of your inner river be still, while the rest of you drifts down into the wordless part night, where even great floods are distant, and all that matters is a slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. In and out, like tides, like ages, like the long, patient heartbeat of the world.